Xavier Guillory might be the number 2 receiver for the Sun Devils in 2023, so let's predict his stats on this edition of the Locked On Sun Devils podcast.
You are Locked On Sun Devils, your daily podcast on the Arizona State Sun Devils, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to the Locked On Sun Devils podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Richie Bradshaw, and I will be your guide for everything Arizona State Sun Devils. A special shout out to my everydayers that are here every day. Don't forget to hit like or subscribe and turn on those notifications so you get an update whenever we post new content, and stay in touch by following me on Twitter at RichieBrads36 and the podcast at LO_Sun Devils. Now, yesterday, we talked about Elijhah Badger, the Sun Devils' solidified number 1 receiver heading into the year, and how Badger could be in for a career year. In case you missed it, I did predict 1,000 yards for him, but if you missed the rest of the episode, make sure you check it out. It's wherever you get your podcasts. Listen to my predictions for receptions, yards, touchdowns, and potential awards as well. With Xavier Guillory, very intriguing wide receiver. He is a transfer from Idaho State. He's got a pretty good resume to him. Just about a little less than 1,500 yards. He had a career year in 2022, setting career highs across the board, 15 catches, 785 yards, and 4 touchdowns for the Bengals. And overall, he definitely looks the part of a potential number 1 receiver. At least he did that with Idaho State. He will be coming to Arizona State, and I think in a best case scenario, he's the number 2 receiver. But I will tell you that during spring practice, he looked so much better than everybody else. And for the record, we have a lot of really good receivers. Like, I've still got 2 more that I want to talk about this week. This week will be a 4-episode podcast, but Guillory still stood out amongst the rest of the guys here. And that's talking about Giovanni Sanders, who I'm very big on and is a friend of the podcast. That's talking about Andre Johnson and Mel Constable, Jake Smith, like the plethora of talents that we have at the wide receiver position. Guillory looked like the number 1 receiver there outside of Elijhah Badger, which is why for his stat predictions, I am predicting him as the number 2 receiver here. Before we officially go over stat predictions, I want to lead off with this. For the remainder of the week, as we look at these receivers, the highs and the lows are going to, potentially catch some people off guard. This is not contradictory to these other receivers. If I'm predicting guys to be 900 yards and 1,000 yards, I'm not saying we're going to have 4 guys that do that. I'm saying that that's their best case scenario if the stars line up. So that's out of the way. I'm sure I'll remind you the rest of the week as well. Let's start with the receptions. Now, I think that Guillory, while he is the number 2 receiver, is probably the 3rd option on this offense. We can't forget about Jaelen Conyers, who we'll get into next week, but he's still going to be an important factor for the Sun Devils this year. He's the number 3 option. He's the number 2 receiver more than likely, which is why I still think he's going to get some work. My highest I can see for receptions, and I mean, this is still pretty high here, is 60 catches. And I think that that would be an outstanding year for him if he was able to accomplish that. He's going to get some decent volume this year. Again, he's the number 2 receiver. Last year for the Sun Devils, Giovanni Sanders recorded 40 receptions. He was 2nd on the team, and he's going to have an opportunity to potentially be that for the Sun Devils, is kind of that number 2 receiver for the team. So I'm looking forward to what he can possibly do for the team. But again, Giovanni Sanders last year had 40 receptions as the number 2 receiver. I don't see any reason that Guillory shouldn't be able to replicate something like that. In the best case scenario, got him at 60. In my worst case scenario, I think this is still probably a 30 catch guy. I will tell you that I wouldn't be surprised if it was in the 20s, but I'm sticking with 30 because I just don't feel like you are in a situation where you can't get Guillory involved. He's too good of a player. And it would be irresponsible, honestly, to not want to get Guillory involved as much as possible in this offense when he's got the ability to be a potential number one receiver in the future. If Badger were to declare for the draft after this year, I would feel pretty confident in Guillory taking over as number one. But also, he's just a, a very, very great complimentary guy and somebody that, again, to emphasize this, would be very irresponsible to not get involved. My final prediction for his catches, I am going a little bit on the higher side here. I think he's going to be around a 50 catch guy. If Giovanni Sanders can pull in 40 from the slot, I think that Guillory should be able to, again, like I said, at least match it. I think it's going to be a little bit better because I think that Guillory is a little bit better of a receiver. You look at the talent here, and he's somebody that can do a little bit underneath, but he's also somebody that can do a lot over the top. And that's where I think he's going to find his biggest strength, is as a deep threat for the team. We'll hop into talking about the yards here in just one moment. But the bottom line here for the receptions, I think he's going to still have a pretty involved role in the offense. It would not be smart to avoid him. As long as he stays healthy, I don't see any reason why he can't be the number two receiver on this team. Guys, I'm here to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's the number one place for you to go and have some fun. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets. You can get up to $200. That's right. Just $20 and you'll have $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. So head today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. As always, thank you guys for tuning in on tomorrow's edition of the podcast. We will be talking about one of the new receivers that's coming in, transfer from Colorado, Jordan Hudson. Make sure that you tune in as we talk about Jordan Hudson on this edition of the Locked On, or tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Sun Devils podcast. Back into Arizona State Sun Devils football, looking at stat predictions for Xavier Guillory. I was just talking about Jordan Hudson and it threw me off. Talking about stat predictions for Xavier Guillory. Next up is going to be some, what are they called? Not receiving stats. Receiving yards. Oh my goodness. Totally drew a blank there. But for Arizona State, looking at receiving yards for Xavier Guillory, I think that there is a drastic difference between the highest that he could possibly be and the lowest that he can possibly be for Arizona State. We'll start with the highest, of course, and I've got 900 yards for him. Yeah, you heard me. In a potential high-flying offense for Arizona State, you've got a wide receiver who is capable of 900 receiving yards. This would be a scenario where maybe Jaelen Conyers doesn't take off at the tight end position, or maybe this is a Sun Devils team that throws for close to 4,000 yards. This is definitely the biggest, highest case scenario for the Sun Devils that I see for the team. It would be a dramatic kind of season for the passing game. But this would also be really based on his ability to stretch the field, because with the 60 catches that I projected him, he would have well over 14 yards per reception. And when you're doing something like that, you're clearly doing something right in the deep passing game. So with Guillory, there is some pretty solid speed here. I'm not willing to mark or plant my flag on how fast he is, whether he's a 4.3 guy or if he is a 4.5 guy. But I do think that he is a very quick player who's able to do a lot deep down the field. He showed that ability last year with the Bengals. He showed that ability during his spring practice session with the Sun Devils. I think that he is destined to become a deep threat receiver for the Sun Devils. Hence why I think a huge best case scenario is probably around 900 yards. I also think that you're probably looking at a dude who's going to be averaging over 14, maybe even 15 yards per reception. His career best is 18 yards per reception. He did that as a freshman with Idaho State. I am really interested to see how high his yards per reception can possibly be. Because even in a situation where he's maybe not 900 yards, let's say he's in the 5 to 700 yard range, if he's doing that on 30 to 40 ish catches, he could be a really big time deep threat for the team. And that's what intrigues me the most with him. Going to the low, though, I only got 300. And for the math whizzes out there, with the 30 catches I have, that's a flat 10 yards per reception. I think that this is a scenario where Guillory is just not a factor in the offense at all. They're not able to get him involved in the deep game, and he's somebody that maybe the team can't figure out what to do with in year one with him. Looking at Guillory and his potential, there's a lot of upside here for him to be a deep threat. But at the same time, there's also a lot of downside for him to not necessarily be the difference maker that we believe that he possibly can be. Because it's easy to think about a player like Andre Johnson in this scenario for the Sun Devils, where even though he's got that deep threat ability, he might not put it all together. I mean, last year, Andre Johnson was under 10 yards per reception. He was under 9 yards per reception at 8.7. And when you think about Andre Johnson, you think about a bigger receiver who can stretch the field a little bit. That wasn't necessarily the case for him last year. In fact, that was entirely not the case for him. There were some big plays, but they couldn't get him consistently involved. That could be the case again for Guillory, is not being able to find a consistent role for him in the offense to where he is able to stretch the field. You also could run into an issue with the quarterback play where these guys are not able to take advantage of the deep passing game. So there's a lot of factors here between the high and the low that I have set for Xavier Guillory, and it's kind of an intimidating high and low for the team. That's kind of my thoughts on that. But my final prediction that I do have here for Xavier Guillory, I have him at 650 yards for his 60 yards, or excuse me, I predicted him 50 receptions, right? For 650 yards, it's a very healthy 13 yards per reception. I think that that's fair. I think that Guillory is going to take a little bit of time to adjust to the FBS level after playing. I think Idaho State is FCS, but I could be incorrect on that. Regardless, it's going to be quite the transition from competition at Idaho State to competition at Arizona State. I think that he's going to be probably right in between. I think that they're going to get him involved in the deep game, though. I think he's going to have a couple home run balls this year, but I also look at him and I feel like this is somebody that they're just going to want to get the ball in his hands underneath, or uh, short to mid range on the field. This is just a receiver that I want the ball in his hands, whether it's quick or whether it's deep down the field. The ability he has to be able to create after the catch. He did that very well at Idaho State. Well, it wasn't just a deep threat, it was the ability to make defenders miss and then do whatever he can do after that. I look at Guillory, and that's what I want out of him. I don't want him to solely be a deep threat for the team, because that's what they've tried to do with Andre Johnson, and I feel like that's been a disservice to Andre Johnson. I don't want Guillory to be pigeonholed into that kind of role. So my prediction there is 650 yards for him. Again, make sure you tune into tomorrow's show as we talk about Jordan Tyson, not Jordan Hudson. My apologies for getting that incorrect. Jordan Hudson was one of the guys that was rumored to us. Jordan Tyson is the receiver that's coming to Arizona State from Colorado. Tune in tomorrow as I talk about him. I got some news for you guys. I am very, very much a fan of Jordan Tyson. So tune in tomorrow as we talk about him. All right. Final predictions here for touchdowns. We'll go over my final stat predictions and then kind of the impact he'll have in year one with the team. We're going to talk about a best case scenario for touchdowns. This isn't a double digit touchdown guy, in my opinion. I actually have him also at 7 touchdowns for Arizona State. I predicted that yesterday for Elijhah Badger was 7 touchdowns. I think that he's probably in that same realm, but in a best case scenario. This would be him being a big time deep threat for the Sun Devils. This would be him having that 14-ish yards per reception, or, best case is north of 15. He has that potential to be a number 2 receiver. And because of that, and because of the offense that's going to be much more explosive in 2023, I think that he could potentially run into that kind of situation where he does score a handful of touchdowns for the team. Now, with that in mind, Arizona State, while they did throw a decent 18 touchdowns last year when you consider the circumstances, there was only what, or I suppose the other 2 receivers not named Elijhah Badger that got into the end zone were Andre Johnson and Giovanni Sanders, and both of them only had 1 touchdown. Jalen Conyers had 5, Messiah Swinson and Xavier Guillory each had 2. So we didn't see much production out of the receivers last year. I think that this could be a breakout scenario for another receiver in the offense like Xavier Guillory. I don't think I'm going to be very high on touchdowns for any other guy, whether that's Jordan Tyson, Giovanni Sanders, or any other of the guys on the offense. I don't know that I'm going to be as high on touchdowns as I am on Xavier Guillory, just letting you know ahead of time. But at the same time, my low, I've only got 2. This would be a scenario similar to what we've seen with the lows on the receptions and the receiving yards. He's just not able to get involved in the offense. Sure, he is able to get in twice, which is double what another receiver had last year that wasn't Elijhah Badger, but this would be a worst case scenario for me, is just the inability to get into the end zone. And obviously the quarterbacks could have some play into that, but I don't think the quarterbacks will have as much to do with the number 2, number 3, number 4 wide receivers on the team. I think that's going to depend on usage. I think it's going to depend on their ability to stand out, and it's going to be on their ability to be consistent threats on the outside. If Guillory's not able to put together a consistent season, it's going to be difficult to project him with more than 2 touchdowns. My final prediction here, right-ish in the middle, I'm going 4. I think that 4 touchdowns is a good year for a number 2 receiver and for an offense that's not gonna score too much. But again, this is a best case scenario. This is also not going to be predicated on what I'm doing for the other receivers, because I'll tell you now, I think 4 touchdowns is probably a sweet spot for a handful of these guys. This is not going to, if you add up all these stats and I have like 40 touchdown passes, I doubt I get that far. But if it gets that far, that is just all predictions, and it's not necessarily based on each other. But for these 4 touchdowns, I do think that he's going to have a couple home runs, and I think that he's going to have a couple shorter to mid-range kind of touchdowns. I think he kind of splits it half and half. Yeah, that's my bottom line there. Final predictions all around. 50 receptions, 650 yards, and 4 touchdowns for the team's number 2 receiver. I feel pretty good about that. That's where I stand with it. And then as far as impact in year 1, I think he is the number 2 receiver for the team. And I think that this is a really good season for him to introduce himself and potentially audition to be the number 1 receiver, because it's going to be a really different offense in 2024. You could potentially lose Elijhah Badger if he goes to the pros. Giovanni Sanders and Andre Johnson will be out of eligibility and will be moving on from the team. Jordan Tyson will still be around more than likely, but this could potentially be Xavier Guillory's offense. We'll obviously cross that bridge when we get to it, but I do think that 2023 is going to be his audition to be the number 1 receiver in the offense beyond the 2023 season. But what do you guys think of Xavier Guillory? What are your expectations? What are your stat predictions? Let me know in the comments if you're on YouTube, or you can tweet at me at RichieBrads36 and the podcast at LO_Sun Devils. That's all that I got for you guys today. Again, tomorrow's episode, we'll be talking about Jordan Tyson, not Jordan Hudson. So make sure that you guys tune in, and wherever you're getting your podcast, hit like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you get an update whenever we post new content. That's all that I have for you guys today on the Locked On Sun Devils. Until next time, you keep it locked right here on Locked On Sun Devils.